Yes, so thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for the organizers. It is a pleasure to be able to present my work of my doctoral thesis that I more or less summarize a little bit in this paper, some of the findings. I'm going to start by showing you this picture, which I took from the book from Peter Andres, Border Games. Basically, is the same border crossing point in two different periods of time. This is San Isidro, California in 1991 and San Isidro, California 1999. And you can see that there was a dramatic change in the landscape already. And I didn't manage to get the picture for how it would be nowadays, but we'd probably see drones flying around, and instead of one line, we will see probably two borders, because now they leave sometimes a space in order for vehicles of the Border Patrol to patrol the border more effectively, and now they have night vision and so on. So there has been an escalation in the terms of the security that is deployed in violence, and no one is really challenging that this escalation took place. So I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about Mexican migration to the US. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about theories of violence in Mexico. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit the methods that I am using, the results, and my conclusion. So, Mexican migration to the US. This time series, I took it from Puzzle and Vera, 2012, so they are taking the information from several data sources, and it basically shows that there was an escalation of Mexican migration to the US during the 1990s. Remember, in 1995, we had the peso crisis that basically the banking system of Mexico collapsed, and that generated a lot of Mexicans to flee from the country, looking for better economic prospects in the US. And then we have the 2000s as well. And in the year 2000, remember that the US was going through a very tough crisis. And again, there was another crisis in 2008. But we also have September 11 in 2001. And we see this dramatic decline in Mexican migration to the US. And people who is studying Mexican migration to the US have studied these factors, and they are quite perplexed because they don't have a complete explanation of the phenomenon. They say it has to do with demographic changes in Mexico. It has to do also with border controls, and it also has to do with economic reasons in Mexico. So they have made some series of macroeconomic reforms, and they have achieved macroeconomic stability in Mexico, and this apparently has to do with less economic migrants going to the US. However, what makes the thing even more intriguing is the fact that this decline of Mexican migration to the US is taking place at the exact moment that we have a criminal civil war in Mexico. So think a little bit about the accounts that we have from Syrian refugees, and what we usually hear in interviews with migrants from Syria is that they are basically fleeing violence from Syria. If you have some if you take a look at some UN estimates about the figures about people that have been killed in the Syrian conflict, you will come up with a figure which is more or less about 250,000 people killed related to the Syrian conflict. Well, if you see the figures that are linked to the victims linked to organized crime in Mexico, you have a figure that it's over 100,000. So you have more or less similar figures, even though Mexico is obviously a larger country, a bigger country, and has a larger population. But it is not so different type of a phenomenon which is taking place. And for me, every war is a criminal war anyway. So the question is, why are these two trends taking place simultaneously? And here I follow a little bit the advices of some professors that advised me when I started to do my doctoral thesis, that they gave me a very simple advice, which is basically take two things that are apparently unrelated and try to find the mechanisms that more or less explain the relationship with this phenomenon. And this is more or less what I'm trying to do here. So, well, it's probably a little bit simplistic, but a large part of my thesis is an exercise of shadow boxing with the theories that try to account for the rise in violence in Mexico. So, for example, we have heard of a world systems theory and this idea that neoliberalism is penetrating communities and is ripping off resources, and whenever they rip off resources, these members of these communities end up being either victims or perpetrators of communities. Well, the problem is that the evidence doesn't fit so well to the narrative, because if we see since the 1980s, when Mexico started a process of trade liberalization, you see, for example, an increase in the share of the foreign direct investment of the Mexican GDP. And for a long time, violence was on a decrease. So what we have with regards to the Mexican criminal insurgency or criminal civil war that is taking place, we have basically a U-shape. So this has some problems in explaining and providing evidence to that neoliberalism theory. If we leave aside economic sociologists and we ask family sociologists what they see, well, they pretty much give us a story about divorces. The rate of divorce is an important predictor of criminal violence, because divorce has very negative effects in very important social indicators, like, for example, when a family goes through a divorce, it usually becomes poorer because a divorce is a very costly thing, and children are left behind without anyone to look out for them, because the mother, if we are talking about a traditional family, has to go out and look for a job, and therefore these children get out from the household, and then they go into the street, and then they get incorporated into criminal gangs and so on. So you have all this narrative over there. But the problem, again, is that the rate of divorce has been increasing since the 1990s, and you don't have these nuances that you see, for example, with the rate of homicides in Mexico. And then, of course, I am trying to become a migration scholar, and I have to fight with political scientists, which basically says that the most important factor behind the criminal war that is taking place in Mexico is political, which is basically the transition to democracy that has taken place over the last 30 years in Mexico. Is that so? Well, let's see, because if we take, for example, the effective number of parties as an indicator of democratization in a country who transited from a single-party system in the pre-times to a multi-party system nowadays, we see the same problems that we see with the other narratives, which is basically an increasing number of options to vote for example, parties represented in the countries, and we don't have something that fits to this nuance that we see in, with regards to violence in Mexico. So, of course, their explanation is much more complicated. So basically what they are putting forward is a story in which democratization erodes the peaceful configurations between corrupt governments and criminal organizations, and the key player in this story are opposition parties, because opposition parties press the incumbent in order to exert the law, and therefore whenever they exert the law, then you see this kind of violence, because then the government starts to break this arrangement. And this is this vertical line that I drew here is Operativo Michoacán, which the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, launched a series of law enforcement operations, beginning with this one in the state of Michoacán, which resulted in an increase in violence. Okay, this makes more sense. However, what happens with this narrative is that if we get some help from historians, you will basically see that in the long-term picture, the rate of violence during the transition to democracy period in Mexico is way lower by these times than when the PRI used to rule the country by itself, like the so-called Pax Priista times. So this is one problem with this narrative. And the second one is that you cannot explain why there was not a surge in violence in previous law enforcement operation, like this one who took place in 1978, which is called Operación Cóndor, which was a massive operation in an area in Mexico which is called the so-called Golden Triangle, which is the border between Durango, Sinaloa, and Chihuahua, which is basically what they captured Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán last week, if you have been following the news in Mexico. And other types of law enforcement operation when they seized, for example, the ranch of a known drug dealer called Caro Quintero, which this ranch was called the El Búfalo, and it used to produce like a lot of marijuana for the US market. So this is the story that the political scientists are putting forward, and as you see, it has some difficult points to explain. So of course, I am trying to provide an alternative narrative to this major problem in Mexico, and I am based my narrative with regards to border controls and migratory policies to Mexican violence. And my main inspiration has been Albert Hirschman, this idea which came, or at least I knew it by reading Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, and his considerations that he had on his previous work, in which basically he reflected of migration as a safety valve, yes, and this idea that Europe became less violent and less turbulent because there were a lot of Europeans who migrated to the US in the 19th centuries. So now, to me, it fits a little bit better the picture, because the thing is not explaining outmigration in terms of violence, which of course there is a lot of outmigration going on, but it's mostly internal, but to explain violence in terms of outmigration. So another part of my thesis, what I do is to try to unpack this metaphor of the safety valve and try to see what really this means in terms of causal mechanisms. So I did that obviously by reviewing theories in political violence, criminology, migration studies, but also by going into the highlands and trying to interview peasants over there mostly. And what you see there is that there is an increased competition for scarce resources in some of these lands. There is a deflection into a more dangerous occupation. So basically peasants who used to be migrants or who used to be in some sort of a migratory behavior, they leave aside this migration option, and then they start growing poppy crops or marijuana, and then this brings either the Mexican army, or this attracts the drug organization and so on. There is an impossibility to pay back debts at the community level. So, for example, a large share of remittances is used to pay back debts, like around 14%, depending on the survey that you use. And since you don't have this remittance in order to pay back debts, you have all these intercommunitarian problems going on that used to be solved whenever you pay back your debts. Outmigration ceased to be an interrupter of blood thought, which basically means that, I mean, we know there is a lot of heterogeneity with regards to reasons for migrate. So think, for example, of a love affair in a very small community. The perfect excuse in order to stop violence is to live to the US and work there, and then you have a justifiable excuse to stop violence. And this is very important, remittances help to improve educational attainment and broaden opportunities. So if you see the very brief interview that Sean Penn made to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, he basically asked him, the interpreter asked him, well, you know, Mr. Guzman, your business is very violent, and what is going on? Why do you do this? And he says, well, it's true. I mean, it's a very violent business, this drug dealing business. But the place in which, from whom I come from, there are basically no opportunities. And that is his answer. And this, I found evidence that he's basically saying the truth. Because what I basically do is that I use this time series, but also I do cross-sectional. I also take into account the cross-sectional variation. So I did event count models for the 2,456 municipalities in Mexico during a 10-year span. And I also did participant observation and the semi-structural interviews that I already explained a little bit. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. So this is a little bit of the results that I have now. So it's a fixed effect, negative binomial, regression estimates of annual counts of homicides by municipality for 10 years. Negative binomial is basically based in the Poisson regression. So it counts events, so we are counting homicides. And the important thing is to focus on the coefficients a little bit. They are negative. So this basically says that either outmigration or either remittances are negatively correlated with violence or the occurrence of a homicide in a given municipality. And this is very important because when you take into account the interaction between remittances and secondary schooling, it's very important, the effect. So that 8 that you see at the last, slide is basically, you have to subtract that 8 from a 1, and then you have a 20% decrease in violence expected to be associated with a 1% decrease in a household that receives remittances in a given municipality. And these are basically my conclusions. Outmigration is negatively associated with homicidal violence. Mexico previously benefited from outmigration to the US because the departure of unsatisfied people increased political and social stability in the country. Remittances helped in alleviating poverty, and for decades, peace seemed to be an unintended outcome of outmigration and remittances. So basically, without outmigration and remittances, Mexico would have gotten into today's bottleneck years ago. Thank you very much.